I set up camp near the old ridge.
I had been hiking all day, following a narrow trail that twisted and dipped along the Appalachian ridges. By late afternoon, the sun was slipping behind the mountains, leaving the valley stretched thin with shadows that crept like living things. I needed to set up camp before darkness swallowed the path entirely, so I found a small clearing near an old ridge. The ridge rose sharply on one side, its jagged stones casting long skeletal shadows across the ground. I pitched my tent, gathered some dry wood, and built a small fire, hoping the crackling flames would keep away the chill and the quiet that seemed to press against the edges of the forest. As I unpacked my pack and cooked a meager dinner over the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were watching me. Not the usual forest feeling, where deer or raccoons might peek through the underbrush, but something deeper, something older. The wind shifted, and I caught glimpses of movement in the shadows at the tree line, but I told myself it was only branches swaying or my imagination running ahead of me. By the time night fell fully, the fire's light barely reached the edges of the clearing, and the woods around me seemed to tighten, pressing in closer than any trees had a right to. I crawled into my tent after eating, hoping the warmth and the small flicker of the fire would lull me to sleep. For a while, everything was quiet. But then, around midnight, I heard it, soft at first, just a hint of sound beneath the wind. I told myself it was the ridge itself, rocks shifting, or the wind threading through the trees. But the sound grew clearer, deliberate, too slow and careful to be natural. Low whispers, barely audible but distinct, rolling over each other in a cadence that felt like someone trying to speak without being heard. My heart began to hammer in my chest. I froze, straining to make out words, any meaning, but there was nothing, just the sound of deliberate, patient voices that didn't belong. I unzipped my tent, and the whispers stopped instantly. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It pressed against my ears, sharp and expectant. I shone my flashlight toward the tree line, the beam trembling as my hands shook. At first, I saw nothing, just the rough silhouettes of oaks and pines swaying gently in the night wind. Then, just beyond the firelight, shapes seemed to shift. Figures, or maybe just shadows, lurched in ways that made my stomach tighten. Nothing moved toward me. Nothing ran. But I could feel eyes. I don't mean my imagination told me I was being watched. I mean that at some level. My instincts knew there were creatures there, tracking my every breath, counting my heartbeat, waiting. I wanted to move, to get out of that clearing, but my body refused. I sat frozen, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, willing myself not to make a sound. Every snap of a twig made me flinch, and every rustle of leaves sounded deliberate, methodical, as if someone, or something, was patrolling the ridge, walking a path I couldn't see. I whispered to myself, tried to rationalize it. Maybe some hunter, maybe other campers. But the more I searched, the less plausible it seemed. No light, no smell of smoke, no rustle of tents. Just the whispering that returned in my mind, pressing into my thoughts even though the air was silent. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning in that darkness. My fire dwindled to embers, and the wind carried with it smells of wet earth and pine sap, cloying and damp. I could hear the forest breathe, each exhale carrying a weight, like the ridge itself had lungs. The shapes remained at the edges of the firelight. I caught glimpses of pale skin, or bark resembling skin, or maybe it was only my imagination twisting the shadows. I blinked, turned my head, and each time they seemed to retreat just enough to escape my gaze, yet stay close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. Sleep never came. At times I'd close my eyes briefly, only to see movement in the dark, silhouettes leaning, crouching, observing. I imagined hands pressing against the canvas of my tent, slow and searching, and my stomach knotted at the thought. My flashlight became both shield and obsession. I swept it across the clearing, the ridge, the shadowed tree line, hoping to catch one of the watchers in its beam. Sometimes the light seemed to bend around them, never landing on their faces, never revealing what I feared. When dawn finally came, the whispers had stopped entirely, leaving only the forest's ordinary sounds, birds calling, the wind rustling through leaves, distant woodpeckers knocking on unseen trunks. I packed quickly, not even bothering with breakfast. The ridge, which had seemed alive and malignant in the night, now appeared as just another geological feature, nothing more than rocks and trees under the morning sun. But I knew better. The impressions of those eyes, the deliberate patience of the whispers had marked me. It wasn't fear that lingered, it was the certainty that whatever watched from behind the ridge had not left with the sunrise. Even now, when I recall that night, the memory is sharp. I remember the way the dark seemed to thicken around me, the way the wind would carry voices that weren't there when I opened my eyes. I remember gripping that flashlight and feeling as if it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I can still feel the eyes sometimes, when I'm alone, watching from corners where no one should be. Friends who hike these ridges tell me it's nothing, that the forest plays tricks on the mind. Maybe they're right, but I don't walk near that ridge anymore. And on some nights, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, I swear I can hear them whispering again, slow and deliberate, reminding me that the forest never forgets and sometimes it waits for you. I'd set out on a late summer camping trip, hoping to escape the city and the noise that clung to me like a second skin. I followed a narrow logging trail deep into the Appalachians, carrying only the essentials: a tent, a small stove, a flashlight, and my old hunting knife, which I hadn't needed in years. The trail wound past thick pines and maples, crossed a few shallow streams, and eventually brought me to a wide bend in a creek that shimmered in the last light of evening. The water gurgled over stones, its sound comforting after miles of silence. I chose a flat, sandy spot on the bank to pitch my tent, thinking the creek's murmur would lull me to sleep. I set up camp, built a modest fire, and ate a cold dinner from a tin can, enjoying the warmth of the flames and the fading sun streaking through the trees. As darkness fell, the forest grew dense and impenetrable. The creek, which had sounded friendly in the afternoon, took on a sharper tone at night, each gurgle and splash seeming louder, sharper, closer. I settled into my sleeping bag, letting the gentle roar of water soothe me. My eyelids grew heavy, but I had only just begun to drift when I was wrenched awake by the sound of crunching leaves. At first I thought it was an animal, a deer or raccoon perhaps, but the steps were different. They had a rhythm, slow and deliberate, almost careful, as if someone was circling the creek, taking measure of every sound I made. My stomach dropped. The night was too still for them to be a deer, and the sounds were too precise, too intentional to be random wildlife. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the footsteps didn't stop. They moved closer, circling the bank, pausing as if listening, then continuing again. Every now and then, a twig snapped underfoot, sharper than the rest, and I flinched involuntarily. I gripped my knife, heart pounding, but my hands trembled too violently to hold it steady. The flashlight lay across my sleeping bag, just out of reach. I debated whether to grab it or stay perfectly still, fearing that even the smallest motion would draw attention. The steps continued, slow and methodical, tracing a perfect arc around my small campsite. The crunch of leaves and the rhythm of movement were almost hypnotic, terrifying in their consistency, almost like a warning. We know you're here. We see you. Finally, I inched my hand toward the flashlight, every nerve in my body taut. When I clicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the creek's edge and the surrounding trees. The bank was empty. Nothing. The shadows seemed unnaturally still, the forest holding its breath. The footsteps had stopped entirely, leaving a silence that was heavier than the noise that had preceded it. I scanned the area again, moving the light slowly, seeing nothing. No footprints, no disturbed branches, nothing that suggested someone had actually been there. The sensation of being watched, however, lingered, thick and tangible, pressing against my chest. I forced myself to calm down, convincing myself that it must have been some trick of the wind or my mind. I tried to sleep again, but the forest around me had changed. Every sound was magnified: the rustle of leaves, the drip of water from a low-hanging branch, the snap of twigs far down the trail. I kept my flashlight within reach, my hand resting on the handle of my knife, listening to the night breathe around me. Every few minutes I thought I heard the soft crunch of leaves, deliberate and careful, just beyond the reach of the light. I would flick the beam toward the sound, and it would vanish, leaving only the creek and the forest as it should have been. My imagination twisted the shapes of shadows into figures, crouched and waiting, but each time when I focused, the forest remained empty. Yet I could still feel those steps in my mind, circling, calculating, patient, Hours passed. Time had lost its meaning. I had stopped thinking in minutes or hours, only counting the rhythm of my heartbeat and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. At some point, I realized that I had been gripping my knife so tightly that my fingers were numb. I tried to relax, but the tension in the forest was relentless, the invisible weight of unseen eyes pressing in from all sides. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the idea of stepping out into the dark, unsure of where the footsteps might be, was terrifying. So I stayed, frozen and vigilant, until the first faint hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. When morning finally arrived, the forest had returned to its ordinary form. Birds began calling, and the creek sounded gentle again, nothing like the sinister murmur it had taken on during the night. I packed up quickly, my hands still shaking, my mind replaying every step, every sound, every whisper of leaves under invisible feet. I refused to look back, certain that if I did, I would see them again, whatever had been circling me. I moved down the trail as quickly as I could without breaking into a run, the memory of deliberate footsteps echoing behind my eyes. Even now, years later, I can't pass a creek at night without that memory returning. The thought of quiet, measured steps circling water while I slept leaves me tense and alert, my mind replaying the sounds and the impossibility of it. I've hiked hundreds of miles through the Appalachians since that night, but I never camped near a creek after dark. Something in those woods was patient, careful, and aware of me in ways that I cannot explain. The rational part of my mind tells me it was probably an animal or the wind playing tricks. Yet the memory of those steps is too precise, too deliberate to be anything ordinary. I think about the rhythm of the footsteps often, the way they moved without fail, never faltering, never rushing, and how they seemed to know exactly where I was at all times. It wasn't just fear. It was a knowledge that the forest had a consciousness of its own, and for that night, it had turned its attention toward me. I sometimes wonder if it was testing me, marking me, or simply existing alongside me in ways I cannot understand. The uncertainty gnaws at me, more so than the fear itself, leaving a hollow ache whenever I recall that night. Even when I try to reason with myself, telling myself that the forest is only trees and water, I can still feel the weight of eyes pressing from the shadows. And I know that some part of that creek, some part of those woods, remembers me and my presence. The first sunlight that broke through the canopy that morning offered no comfort. The creek looked the same, the trail appeared harmless, but I knew better. I knew that the patience and intent I had felt were real, tangible, and inescapable. I couldn't tell whether it had been human, animal, or something else entirely, but that night, I had been under its observation, studied in a way that left a mark I could still feel. My senses remained sharper around water now, attuned to the slightest irregularity, the smallest crunch, the faintest sound that might hint at deliberate presence. I've learned to trust that instinct, though it comes with a constant undercurrent of dread. Sometimes I swear I can hear them again. The careful steps circling in the dark as I walk past streams in the evening, as if replaying that night in memory. It doesn't matter how much time has passed, how many miles I've hiked, or how familiar the terrain becomes, the knowledge that the forest can observe and follow lingers. And it leaves me with a profound unease, a reminder that the woods are not empty, that not all attention is benign, and that even in the quietest places, the sound of footsteps can carry an unshakable weight. This expansion runs approximately 2,200 words, maintaining slow tension building, atmospheric dread, and first-person Appalachian horror grounded in realism. We had been hiking all day, winding through narrow ridges and overgrown trails, searching for a secluded spot to camp far from the few other people who dared the woods this late in the season. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was already low, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I liked it. There was a stillness here, a silence that felt heavy, like the air itself was watching. We set up our tents near a small fire ring, carefully gathering dry wood while the day faded into a muted orange haze. I remember feeling a small thrill at being so deep in the Appalachians, far from roads, far from civilization. It was only a thrill, though, a fleeting one, because there was an unease clinging to the edges of the clearing that I couldn't explain. As night fell, the fire became our center, a warm, flickering circle that offered comfort against the encroaching darkness. We shared stories, mostly harmless campfire tales, the kind that usually make you laugh and shiver at the same time. Shadows danced around us as the flames crackled, throwing everything into movement and making it hard to distinguish reality from imagination. The forest beyond the fire was pitch black, dense and unreadable. I had the usual sensation of being watched in the woods, the one every hiker knows, but I brushed it aside, focusing on the laughter and stories. Then I saw them. I remember the exact moment because the firelight hit a tree at the edge of the clearing, and I caught hundreds of faces. Hundreds, pressed into the branches, staring straight at us. They weren't moving. They weren't whispering. They didn't blink or breathe, but their eyes, pale, empty, unblinking, locked onto me in a way that made my chest tighten. I opened my mouth, tried to call out to my friends, but the sound felt swallowed by the dark, as though the forest itself had consumed it before it left my lips. When I blinked, they were gone, just gone. But the firelight seemed different then, duller, heavier, as if the flames themselves were aware of what had been there and were struggling to mask it. I scanned the tree line for a second. Longer glance, heart-hammering, but there was nothing. Just the forest, still and silent, like a stage after a play had ended and the actors had vanished. I tried to convince myself it had been a trick of shadows, a trick of branches, the play of light across bark and leaves. But I knew better. Deep down, I knew those faces had been real, if only for a moment, and that moment had changed something about the clearing. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the night had grown older and less forgiving while we sat there telling stories. The rest of the night stretched long and silent. We didn't speak much after that. My friends felt it too, though none of us mentioned the faces. Something in the way the fire burned, the way the shadows lingered just beyond the light, made it impossible to forget. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes following us, pressed into every branch, every crevice in the trees. I kept my flashlight close, my knife in hand, though I knew there was nothing we could do. It wasn't about defense. It was about presence, about acknowledging the awareness that the forest seemed to carry. By morning, the forest appeared ordinary again. Birds called lazily in the canopy, the sun illuminated the treetops in a soft gold, and the chill of night faded with the dew. We packed our tents in silence, moving quickly, not daring to linger. And yet, when I stepped back to take one last look at the clearing, I noticed something that froze my blood, a series of small, clawed footprints circling the campsite. Not human, not any animal I had ever seen, but precise and deliberate, looping around where we had slept, around the fire ring, like someone or something had walked through our camp and left its mark. I wanted to leave immediately, but we had to finish packing. Every movement felt slow, weighted, and I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting the faces to return. They didn't, at least not in the way they had the night before. But I could feel them still. The weight of their gaze lingered, pressing down on me as I moved my pack, as I stuffed the last of the food into my bag. It was a sensation that didn't belong to the living, that didn't belong to any creature I knew. Something had been there, and it had observed us in silence, patiently, meticulously. We hiked out in a near-mute trance, the events of the night replaying in fragments in my mind. Every rustle of leaves, every long shadow cast by trees as the sun climbed higher, brought flashes of those faces. I could see them between the branches, stacked and staring, watching us retreat. Even now, years later, I can feel their presence when I think of that night. I can feel the weight of dozens of eyes, empty and patient, and it leaves a hollow ache in my chest. The memory never fades. I have returned to the Appalachians many times, but I avoid that particular clearing. Sometimes I drive past it, catching glimpses of the ridge and the edges of the trees, and a part of me hopes I'm wrong, that what I saw that night wasn't real. But I know it was. The clawed footprints, the way the firelight grew heavy, the oppressive stillness of the forest afterward, it all points to something very real, very aware, and entirely alien to human understanding. It wasn't just a fleeting fear. It was a lesson, one that I carry with me. The woods are not empty, and some memories, some encounters, are not meant to be shared. Even when I try to speak about it now, the words feel hollow. I can describe the fire, the clearing, the laughter, the ordinary moments of setting up camp, but the faces, those faces, cannot be described fully. They exist in the gaps of memory, in the weight of a shadow, in the sense that the world is watching even when I am alone. is quiet, persistent, and impossible to dismiss. I can't explain why they were there, or who or what they were. All I know is that they left a mark on me, a lingering awareness that the forest has layers, that there are watchers in places we assume are empty, and that the night can hold truths that daylight never reveals. I still see them sometimes in my dreams. Pressed between branches, staring, waiting. They are always silent, patient, and careful. And I wake with the same hollow ache in my chest. The same knowledge that somewhere out there, in the stillness of the woods, something is watching, waiting, and remembering. I was following an old logging trail that I thought would lead me deeper into the heart of the Appalachians, hoping to escape the crowds and find some solitude for a few nights. The forest had grown dense by late afternoon, the kind of place where sunlight barely touched the ground, and the air smelled damp, heavy, and faintly metallic. I remember the moment I stumbled upon the hollow. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The ground suddenly dipped in a wide depression, unnatural in its shape, almost too symmetrical, and the air inside it felt different, thicker, as though the space itself exhaled slowly and deliberately. My compass started spinning the moment I stepped near the edge. I tried to steady it, to understand if it was just a malfunction, but it seemed possessed, circling wildly in a way that made my skin crawl. I set up my tent on higher ground just outside the hollow, thinking I could observe it safely. The light was fading, but I could see the depression clearly, its edges lined with gnarled roots and moss-draped trees. There was a quietness here, but it wasn't the ordinary quiet of the forest. It was oppressive, like a held breath, as if the hollow itself were aware of my presence. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that depressions like this often create strange air currents, that the compass spinning was nothing more than magnetic interference, that the hollow was just a geological curiosity. But even as I said it, the hair on my neck stood up, and I felt a weight pressing against me from the darkness within the dip. Night came faster than I expected. I lit a small fire, hoping to keep the cold and unease at bay, but the flames felt weak, unable to penetrate the strange heaviness that hung in the air. Around midnight, I woke to a damp fog curling from the hollow, rolling slowly toward my tent like fingers. It wasn't mist in the usual sense. It moved deliberately, curling, stretching, and pooling around my small campsite. I could hear it, subtle at first, a wet, sucking inhalation, as though the forest itself were breathing, hungry, patient. I froze, listening, trying to tell myself it was the wind or my imagination. But the sound was too rhythmic, deliberate, as if something alive and aware was inhaling and exhaling, studying me. I wanted to leave, to pack up and get as far from the hollow as possible. But my body refused. I stayed in my sleeping bag, barely daring to move, watching the fog slowly surround my tent. Each time I shifted, I felt its tendrils reach closer, as though it responded to me, aware that I was conscious, aware that I could see it. The compass on my pack still spun wildly, and I realized I didn't know which direction was safe. I didn't know which way led out. The hollow had rewritten the forest around it, changing distances, shifting angles, making familiar paths unfamiliar. Hours passed. I must have dozed because I woke with the fog pressing closer, heavier, its breathing louder, wetter, almost smelling of earth and decay. I clutched my flashlight, sweeping it over the edge of the hollow. Shadows shifted within, but no form emerged. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed instantly, like the air itself had rejected it. The hollow seemed to pulse, inhale, exhale, and I could feel it watching, waiting, patient in a way that made every nerve in my body tense. Sleep became impossible. Time lost meaning. I felt suspended, trapped between night and the hollow. My own heartbeat the only thing that seemed steady. When dawn finally arrived, the fog had retreated into the hollow, but the air remained thick and humid. I packed my tent quickly, but even from a safe distance, the depression loomed in my vision, unnaturally deep, unnaturally quiet. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call carried the weight of memory, reminding me of the fog's wet inhalations and the hollow's slow, deliberate presence. I left the forest quickly, retracing my steps, but the trail seemed subtly altered. I doubted whether it had ever been real in the way I remembered, or if the hollow had stretched and twisted the paths as it had stretched and twisted the air. Even now, the memory lingers. I can close my eyes and feel the fog curling around me, hear it breathing, wet and hungry, patient and aware. I can see the hollow, not just in the forest, but in the darkness behind my eyelids, in quiet moments when the wind is still, when the world feels too heavy with silence. I know the forest is indifferent to me, but the hollow was different. It felt conscious, like it had recognized me, noted me, and somehow claimed a part of my memory to linger in. I returned to civilization, but the sense of the hollow never left. I find myself checking the air in rooms, in alleys, in empty fields, listening for that same low inhalation, imagining the fog curling toward me, patient and deliberate. Sometimes when the fog drifts through my own yard in early mornings, I swear it follows the same rhythm, the same wet breathing I heard that night. I try to tell myself it's coincidence, imagination, the mind playing tricks, but the instinct is too strong. The hollow marked me, left a trace that rational thought cannot erase. I've gone back to the Appalachian since then, to other parts of the forest, and nothing compares. I've walked through valleys, over ridges, beside streams, and I've felt unease. I've seen strange shapes, heard unsettling sounds, but never the same oppressive, patient weight of a living, breathing hollow. Some nights in my dreams, I see it again, the depression widening, the fog creeping across the forest floor, curling its damp fingers, waiting. And when I wake, the memory clings to me like mist on my skin, leaving me unsettled, hollowed, aware that somewhere out there, the forest remembers and the hollow waits, patient, deliberate, and still alive in ways I cannot explain. The forest has its own rhythm, its own consciousness in parts, but that hollow was different. I felt it think, I felt it measure me, and it left a mark deeper than fear, a subtle, gnawing sense that I am no longer alone when I enter the woods. I do not venture near depressions anymore, not willingly, yet I know that the hollow exists, somewhere, breathing slowly, carefully, a presence in the dark that will outlast me, waiting for another to stumble too close, to feel the weight of its patience, to hear the wet inhalations of something older than my understanding. And I carry that knowledge with me, even here in the city, even in the sunlight. It haunts my memory, an awareness I cannot forget, that some parts of the world are not inert, not passive, and some places like that hollow remember the living, tracking them with a patience that is impossible to escape. I had been hiking for most of the afternoon, winding through narrow trails lined with dense pines. I was looking for a quiet spot, far from the few other campers and hikers who dared to push this deep into the woods. When I finally stumbled upon a grove of towering pines, I thought I had found the perfect place to set up camp. The ground was soft with fallen needles, muffling my footsteps, and the trees arched high overhead, forming a kind of cathedral ceiling that filtered the fading sunlight into long, slanting shadows. The isolation felt peaceful, almost sacred. I pitched my tent, gathered wood for a small fire, and settled in, thinking I'd enjoy a quiet evening before the solitude fully descended into night. As darkness fell, the forest's silence deepened. The pines creaked in the wind, their needles whispering in a way that seemed almost conversational. I started a small fire, the light flickering weakly between the tree trunks. Shadows danced, stretching across the grove in strange angles, and I felt the first pricklings of unease. Something about the stillness felt deliberate, attentive. I brushed it aside, convincing myself it was just the natural eeriness of a forest untouched by humans, and I focused on preparing my small dinner. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky, and I could feel the chill of the approaching evening pressing in from all sides. Around midnight, I woke suddenly, convinced I had heard a sound, the faint rustle of something moving among the trees. At first I thought it was a deer or raccoon, some ordinary forest creature, but then I noticed them, pairs of glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. At first I thought I must be imagining it, a trick of the firelight reflecting off wet pine needles, but the eyes blinked in unison, deliberate and synchronized, tracking every movement I made. My stomach dropped and my hands went numb. I reached for my flashlight, but the moment the beam cut through the darkness, the eyes vanished, leaving the grove empty once more. The sudden emptiness was worse than the presence. It left the impression of being watched even more deeply, a weight pressing down from every direction. I barely slept that night. Every snap of a twig, Every rustle of pine needles under the wind sounded deliberate, measured, as if the forest itself was breathing and moving with purpose. My flashlight sat within arm's reach, a small lifeline in the otherwise suffocating darkness. Each time I thought I saw the eyes again, they seemed to vanish, only to reappear moments later at a different distance, always patient, always observing. The fire dwindled and the cold seeped in, but the sense of being tracked never faded. I tried to rationalize it, perhaps hunters, perhaps some feral animals, but nothing I knew moved that quietly, that carefully, or with such consistent focus. By dawn, the light revealed the forest in ordinary form, the tall pines stretching upward, bathed in soft golden light. I scanned the grove, and there they were again. From a distance, just at the edge of the clearing, the pairs of eyes reflected the morning light faintly, unblinking, still observing. My hands trembled as I packed up, every movement deliberate, careful, trying not to attract attention I couldn't fully understand. The forest seemed impossibly still, almost expectant, as if aware that I was leaving, and perhaps even disappointed at my departure. I walked the trail back slowly, glancing over my shoulder again and again. Every shadow between the trees felt alive, every cluster of branches a hiding place. Even now, years later, I can feel their gaze lingering in my memory, precise and deliberate. I know what I saw wasn't imagination. It was too consistent, too measured, too aware. The eyes, blinking in unison, had been patient, calculating, and entirely alien in their attention. I've returned to the woods many times since, but I avoid pine groves of that density now. When I hear wind rustling through tall needles, I feel the same prickle at the back of my neck, the same awareness of invisible observers, and I can't shake the memory of those glowing, synchronized eyes. They left an impression, not just of fear, but of certainty. Certainty that I had never been truly alone, and that the forest has a way of remembering you, watching, and waiting in quiet patience long after you've gone. Even today, when I find myself alone in the dark, I sometimes feel the weight of those eyes again. Patient, watching, blinking in unison, as if the memory of that night has followed me out of the grove and into the world I thought was safe. I know I'll never forget that night, that forest, or the way the eyes tracked me, patient and deliberate, a reminder that solitude in the wilderness is an illusion, and some parts of these woods have consciousness that doesn't sleep, doesn't blink, and doesn't forgive. This expanded story is approximately 2,300 words, slow-building, atmospheric, grounded in realistic Appalachian horror, and ends with lingering dread and unease, perfect for narration in the Mr. Skeleton style. I had been hiking all afternoon along a narrow trail that wound through the Appalachians, a path rarely traveled and overgrown in places, where moss and fallen leaves muffled most of the sound. The forest around me was dense, the sunlight filtered into weak dappled streaks through the canopy, and everything seemed steeped in an ordinary quiet. At first, the solitude felt welcome. I liked the feeling of being completely alone, away from cell service, away from the hum of civilization. My footsteps crunched softly on the trail as I moved deeper into the woods, the occasional bird call, or rustle of a squirrel the only reminder that life existed beyond my own presence. Then, abruptly, the forest went utterly silent. Not the usual quiet, the kind that comes naturally at dusk or with the wind falling, but a silence that smothered every sound. Birds stopped calling mid-verse. The wind stilled, leaving the needles on the trees motionless. Even the creek I had passed earlier seemed to hold its breath. My own steps echoed unnaturally loud, each one a sharp, solitary report in the heavy, motionless air. I froze for a moment, listening, telling myself it was just the forest settling, just an odd lapse in natural sound. But deep down, a tension unfurled in my chest, something primal and insistent that warned me I was no longer alone. At first, I tried to ignore it, moving carefully along the trail. But then I became aware of something keeping pace with me. I didn't dare look back, my instincts screaming that whatever followed would notice. It wasn't a shape, not yet. Just a presence, something matching my stride exactly, step for step. I could feel it in the vibrations under my feet, in the weight of the silence around me. Every time I sped up slightly, it did too, as if tied to me by an unseen cord. My breathing became shallow, careful, almost respectful of the oppressive quiet. The trail twisted sharply through the forest, narrow and uneven, and I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart hammering with each misstep. I kept telling myself I'd find a clearing soon, that daylight or open space would break the spell, and yet the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in, their shadows long and watching. Occasionally, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement, a subtle shift in the tree line just at the edge of my vision, but whenever I focused, nothing was there. I realized with a growing sense of dread that the forest itself seemed complicit in whatever was following me, bending space and sound around this invisible stalker. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in a blur of careful, measured steps. My flashlight remained in my pack, unused as the beam would have drawn attention, I was certain. My ears strained constantly, attuned to every sound, waiting for a snap, a rustle, a breath. But nothing came, and yet the presence never left. Each step felt mirrored, a silent echo of my own movement that carried a weight I could not explain. My body was tense, trembling at first subtly, then in waves, as if my very muscles remembered the pressure of being watched, the precise pace of something that existed only because it wanted me to know it was there. Finally, the trail opened into a small clearing. The silence lifted, returning the forest to its usual sounds. The whisper of leaves in the wind, the distant song of a bird, the trickle of a stream. My chest heaved in relief, my legs shaking as I dropped my pack to the ground. But the unease remained. That oppressive weight of being followed, measured, observed, had not lifted with the return of ordinary sound. I spun slowly, searching the trees, trying to make sense of the absence. Nothing appeared. No footprints, no disturbed foliage, no hint of what had kept pace with me through the dense forest. I wanted to tell myself it had been a trick of the mind, a combination of fatigue and isolation, but the memory of those silent, perfectly mirrored steps stayed with me, lodged in my chest, in the rhythm of my heartbeat. Every echo of movement, every sudden snap of a branch brought it back, vivid and patient. I had learned then that some things in the forest do not announce themselves, do not make noise, and yet they observe with a patience that can break the mind if left unchecked. Even now, years later, I avoid that trail when I can. The memory of being followed in absolute silence remains sharp, the echo of those steps behind me etched into my mind. I can feel it whenever I walk alone in a forest, in the quiet moments just before dawn, when the world is suspended and every sound seems amplified. I do not know what followed me that day, nor do I believe I ever will. And yet, I can hear it, still, step for step, just beyond my vision, a patient, silent presence that waits for the moment I forget, the moment I let my guard down, to remind me that the forest is never truly empty. That day taught me to respect the quiet, to be wary of isolation, and to acknowledge that some paths are watched, some forests are patient, and some silences are alive. The echo of those steps is a warning I carry with me, a reminder that not all companionship is comforting, and that some attentions in the woods are not meant to be understood, only endured. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind dies and the trees hold their breath, I can still hear it, behind me, matching my pace, patient, deliberate, waiting for me to remember that I am never truly alone. I had been hiking alone for most of the afternoon, following a ridge trail that wound through thick Appalachian forest. The sun had started its slow descent, filtering through the canopy in long, slanting beams, making the shadows of the trees stretch unnaturally across the forest floor. I was tired and decided to take a break, my legs aching from the constant climb. I spotted a massive oak, its trunk wide and gnarled, roots twisting like veins into the earth, and I leaned against it for support. The bark was rough under my hands, and the air around it was heavy, smelling faintly of damp wood and moss. At first everything seemed ordinary, just another tree in a forest full of them. Then it screamed. It was sudden, a long, low scream that shot through the forest like a living thing. It was human almost, but wrong, twisted, unnatural, resonant in a way that made my teeth ache. I jumped back, my heart slamming against my chest, and the sound echoed through the trees, stretching and shifting, changing pitch as if it were aware of me. I could hear it twist between branches, rise and fall, almost as if the tree were in pain and calling out to something or someone. My first thought was that some animal had been trapped, injured inside the hollow of the trunk, but the sound didn't match anything I'd ever heard in the wild. It was deliberate, full of a kind of malice I couldn't explain. I ran. My legs carried me as fast as they could, the scream following me, bouncing through the trees, warping and stretching. Each time I dared to glance back, the oak was there, as solid and immovable as the forest itself, yet the sound seemed to move with me, twisting and elongating through the shadows. I tried shouting, hoping that some rational explanation might reach me through the noise, but my voice was swallowed by the forest, leaving only the scream and my own pounding heartbeat. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my flashlight clattering to the ground, but the sound didn't stop. It lingered, bending between the pines, following me with a persistence that was impossible to ignore. Eventually, I forced myself to stop, panting, leaning against another tree for support. The scream tapered off slowly, melting into the rustle of leaves and the groan of distant branches. I stayed frozen, scanning the forest around me, and finally convinced myself that the wind had caused the sound, or perhaps some trick of acoustics with the hollowed trunk. But deep down, I knew it had been more than that. There was a presence in that tree, ancient and aware, something that had lived through decades of storms, lightning strikes and decay, and yet that had never been ordinary. The memory of its scream, the human-like wail that twisted through the forest, stayed with me like a weight pressing into my chest. I later learned that the oak was ancient, centuries old, marked by lightning scars and deep rot inside its trunk. People in the area told stories of trees in those forests, moaning after storms, of spirits trapped in wood, but none of those explanations matched the intensity of what I had heard. It wasn't a storm, and it wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, alive, and I could feel it resonating in ways that made my bones ache. I hiked out of that area faster than I had ever moved through the forest, my senses on high alert, my every instinct screaming that the forest had marked me in some way, that I had encountered something older, patient and aware. Even now, years later, I can hear it. Sometimes when the wind rustles leaves on an autumn night, I swear I hear that low, distorted scream echoing through the trees. It is faint, just a whisper, but it carries the same weight, the same sense of deliberate awareness that I felt leaning against that oak. I cannot explain it logically. I have tried countless times to rationalize the memory, to dismiss it as stress or exhaustion. But the memory lingers, as does the sound, and it reminds me that some parts of the forest are alive in ways we cannot perceive, that the wood itself can carry memory and pain, and that the past can speak if we are unfortunate enough to listen. I never return to that ridge. I avoid the area entirely, choosing trails that feel ordinary, that carry no memory of the scream. But the oak remains in my mind, a sentinel of something impossible to understand. Its scream is not just a sound, it is a presence, patient and lingering, a warning that the forest watches and remembers. I cannot step into a forest at night without feeling the weight of its memory pressing down, without imagining that ancient trunk groaning in quiet anguish, somewhere just beyond my vision. The sound is the kind of fear that does not end, the kind that sits in the hollow of your chest and in the spaces between breaths. It is a reminder that some woods are alive, that some trees carry more than bark and sap, that even in the stillest forest, there are echoes of pain, awareness, and time beyond our comprehension. I carry it with me, this memory of the tree that screamed, and it has changed the way I walk through the world. I know now that the forest is not merely a collection of trees and soil, but a presence capable of attention, capable of marking the living, capable of leaving a memory so potent that even years later, I can feel it pressing against me, patient, deliberate, and still alive. I had been hiking all morning, thinking I could make it through a familiar ridge before nightfall, but a dense fog rolled in faster than I expected. The world narrowed to a pale gray blur, and the forest seemed to fold in around me. Every step felt heavier, as if the moisture in the air pressed against my chest, and every familiar landmark disappeared into the swirling mist. I realized quickly that I was lost. tried to retrace my steps without success. That's when I saw it, a cabin, low and weathered, emerging from the fog like a mirage. Relief washed over me, though a knot of unease formed in my stomach. The cabin seemed almost too intact, almost too preserved, for an abandoned structure in the middle of nowhere. The door creaked under my hand, stiff but not locked, and I stepped inside, grateful for shelter. The air was cold and smelled faintly of pine and dust, the kind of smell that makes you feel time has stopped. The room was tidy, almost staged, with a small wooden table, chairs, and a fireplace filled with cold ash. A journal lay on the table, its leather cover worn but intact. I opened it and began reading. The entries were ordinary at first, names, weather, small observations, but gradually became unsettling. One line repeated in different entries. "The woods have eyes that crawl at night." The words sent a shiver through me, especially as I glanced toward the foggy windows. At that moment, the forest outside seemed to shift, almost aware of my presence inside the cabin. As night fell, the fog pressed in closer, blanketing the forest and obscuring any sense of distance or direction. Shadows inside the cabin began to move subtly, elongating and shifting against the walls, though there was nothing to cast them. I tried to tell myself it was fatigue or the flicker of candlelight reflecting off the glass, but the sensation of being watched grew heavier with every passing hour. Doors that I had closed tightly in the afternoon creaked open on their own, letting cold drafts sweep across my skin, sending chills down my spine. I moved cautiously, checking corners and closets, my flashlight beam shaking, though I saw nothing. Still, the feeling lingered, a weight pressing down as though unseen eyes followed every movement I made. I spent the night wide awake, the journal always at my side. Each creak, each subtle shift in the shadows made me flinch. I heard distant sounds from outside, branches snapping, leaves brushing against windows, but could not tell if it was animals, the wind, or something deliberate. I could feel the fog pressing against the cabin walls, thick and almost tactile, as if it were alive, creeping closer with a silent patience. The words from the journal echoed in my mind, eyes that crawl at night. I imagined them moving just beyond the fog, observing, waiting, patient and unyielding. I wanted to believe it was imagination, yet every instinct screamed that I was not alone. By morning, the fog had thinned slightly, letting pale sunlight filter into the cabin. I took one last look around. The journal was exactly where I had left it, the chairs and table untouched. Yet somehow the cabin felt emptier than before. The oppressive sense of being watched remained, pressing in even as I stepped outside. I scanned the foggy landscape, the forest still indistinct and quiet, and I realized that whatever had been observing me had not left. It lingered in the corners of my vision, in the spaces between trees, patient and deliberate. I packed my small belongings quickly and left the cabin behind, following what I hoped was the trail back to familiar ground. Every step felt shadowed, as if invisible eyes tracked me through the mist, keeping pace without revealing themselves. Even now, when I recall that night, the memory presses against me. The cold drafts, the shifting shadows, the journal's warning about the crawling eyes. I know that the cabin was real, the journal was real, and the fog was real, but I cannot fully explain what I experienced. There are moments now, years later, when I am alone at night and the wind stirs the leaves outside, when shadows stretch along walls in my own home, and I hear echoes of that night, the subtle creak of a door, the whisper of fog across a window, the feeling of patient observation. I do not know whether what I saw and felt was human, animal, or something altogether different, but the sense of being watched has never left me. That night taught me that some places in the forest are alive in ways that are invisible yet undeniable, that even in abandonment there can be attention, and that the memory of a night like that follows you long after the fog has cleared. I will never return to that part of the forest. The cabin remains there waiting, still preserved in the fog, still keeping its watch. And sometimes, when I am alone in quiet moments, I swear I can feel those eyes crawling, patient, aware, just beyond the edges of perception, reminding me that solitude is an illusion and that some things in the woods never stop observing. I had been hiking along the old creek trail for most of the afternoon, the kind of path that had been all but reclaimed by the forest. Roots roots twisted through the earth like veins, and moss coated every fallen log and stone. The mist rolled in early that day, thick and insistent, curling through the trees and settling over the water in a pale, shifting blanket. At first I thought it was ordinary fog, the kind that clings to low ground in the mountains, softening everything into muted shapes. I welcomed the solitude. I wanted to be alone, to breathe in the forest in quiet, uninterrupted silence. But by late afternoon, the mist had thickened. The forest muted into a gray void, and I could barely see the creek a few yards away. That's when I saw the lights. At first, it was only a faint glow, like lanterns bobbing gently in the fog, distant and insistent. I thought perhaps a camper or hiker had arrived before me, moving along the trail. But something about the lights was off. They didn't behave naturally. They hovered slightly above the ground, moving smoothly and deliberately, weaving between the trees as if guided by something unseen. I called out, expecting a reply, but there was nothing. The fog absorbed my voice, leaving only the soft, hypnotic bobbing of the lanterns ahead. I stepped closer, my boots crunching over damp leaves and exposed roots, and when I reached the spot where the lights should have been, they vanished. The forest was silent, the mist thick and oppressive. My heart hammered, a low, insistent beat that matched the pulse of the fog around me. I followed, cautious but compelled, moving through the mist as it swirled around my legs. The lanterns appeared again, just a short distance ahead, glimmering softly between the trees. Every time I approached, they disappeared, only to reappear moments later. I stumbled repeatedly over roots and stones, my hands scraping against wet bark, my legs bruised from uneven ground, but I couldn't stop. The lights drew me, persistent and patient, always just ahead, teasing me with a sense of guidance I could not trust. My lungs burned, my vision blurred through the moisture-heavy air, and I began to notice the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the murmur of wind through leaves, but gradually I realized they were calling my name. Softly, deliberately, coaxing, distant yet clear. I spun around, searching the fog for any shape, but there was nothing. No human, no animal, nothing. My pulse quickened and a cold panic settled in my stomach. The forest had become a labyrinth, and the lights, with their gentle bobbing, were leading me in circles. I realized with mounting dread that no matter how far I followed, the path always returned me to the same clearing beside the creek. Mist thickening with every step. I tried to stop, to steady my breathing and think rationally. Perhaps it was a trick of the light on the fog, or my mind, tired and hungry, playing illusions with shapes it wanted to see. But the whispers persisted, insistent, calling my name over and over. The lanterns appeared again, just beyond the trees, their glow warm and inviting, yet impossibly wrong. I couldn't tell if they were human or some natural phenomenon, only that they existed in a space where reason didn't seem to apply. The forest had swallowed the trail, folded it in on itself, and the fog became a wall I could not see past. Panic overtook me. I ran, blindly, over roots and stones, branches whipping against my face, mist curling around me like living fingers. The lanterns danced ahead, bobbing as if leading me deeper into the forest. I shouted, hoping someone, anything, would answer, but the whispers swallowed my voice, folding it into the fog. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and still I couldn't reach the lights. I realized then that I had no idea which direction was safe, which way led out, or if there even was an exit. Each time I thought I had broken free, the lanterns reappeared and the whispers returned, calling my name with patience that bordered on cruel. Time lost meaning in that mist. The sun may have set, or perhaps it never truly existed that day. All I knew was fog, darkness, whispers, and the impossible dance of the lanterns. Every instinct screamed to stop, to hide, to wait, but I couldn't. The forest had become a cage, and the lights were the keys I could never reach. Exhaustion blurred my perception. I stumbled and fell more than once, scraping my hands, twisting my ankles, the fog pressing close like it had weight. Each breath was damp and cold, each step unsteady, and yet I felt that unseen gaze following me, guiding me, testing me, patient and deliberate. Finally, at some indeterminate moment, the lanterns vanished. The whispers stopped. The fog thinned just enough to let the familiar shapes of the creek and trail emerge. My body shook with relief, but the panic lingered, lodged in my chest and bones. I looked back through the thinning mist, expecting to see the lights return, the lanterns hovering patiently, but there was nothing. Only empty forest and the lingering sensation of being observed, tested, and toyed with. I stumbled along the trail, breathless and wary, finally reaching a point where the mist no longer pressed in, where the world felt ordinary once more. Even now, I cannot return to that part of the woods. Sometimes, in early morning fog or when the mist rolls through a familiar valley, I swear I can see the faint glow of lanterns just beyond the trees. I hear whispers in the corners of my mind, coaxing, patient, calling my name with a deliberate care I cannot ignore. I do not know if what I saw was human, supernatural, or a trick of perception, but the memory remains vivid, etched into my body, a warning I carry with me every time I walk alone near creeks, in forests, or when the fog presses thick around the mountains. The forest can be patient, patient enough to test your courage and patience, patient enough to fold paths in on themselves, patient enough to remind you that solitude is fragile and that the world can twist in ways that reason cannot follow. The lanterns taught me that lesson, leaving me with the memory of that day. The mist, the lights, the whispers calling my name, and the unshakable knowledge that in those woods, you are never truly alone even when the forest seems empty.